Good evening, friends. Greetings from Sahitya Sarovar. This is the eighth episode of our conversation series Vaktavya. Today, it's my honor, and I'm very delighted to in conversation with one of the most eminent poets of India. He's not just a poet, but an art curator, a culture theorist, and one of my favorite poet who I am desiring to have an interview from a long time. So eventually today we get our time. So today we are in conversation with Ranjit Hoskote, sir. Good evening, sir. Thank you
Good
so much
evening,
for
Uday.
joining.
Good evening, Uday. It's really a pleasure to join you on this platform.
Yeah, and thank you so much again for agreeing for this conversation. I would begin from one of your old poems. I would say that was in your collection, Vanishing X. That was Tiger poem. I was very much fascinated, or I would say very much curious about the metaphor, or I would say you have personified you and language in that poem in a very strange manner. So, what was your idea, or I would say, what was the main aim that you want to convey through that poem?
You know what, Uday? Tiger poem is actually a very early poem of mine. It appeared in my very first book of poems, which is called Zones of Assault, which was published in 1991. And at that point, like many poets who are uh, starting their journey, it was important for me to think out questions of what kind of habitat is language. If you're a poet, then you treat language as an environment. You learn what its weather is like. You treat it as terrain. You have to map it. So you see this from the very first verse of the poem. It goes like this: In this green dream, language and I face each other alone. Language is forests and hills. I, tiger. So it was really a question of placing the poet or the poet persona in a terrain that needs to be explored, that has to reveal itself, and in which you, as the poet, or I, as the poet, are both at home but also vulnerable. So to me, that's really a key condition of being in language and being in the world. To what extent can you be at home in the world or in language, and to what extent are you vulnerable? That's to me that's a key source of poetry.
Yes, sir. So I would now go towards the beginning of your journey from your childhood. What are the memories associated with your childhood, and what were the contemporary situations at that time that managed you to be a poet, and how poetry happened to you?
Good question. How did poetry happen to me? It was. Let me put it this way. I didn't have to go very far to look for poetry because poetry was all around me at home. I was just fortunate, I think, uh, to have spent my childhood, to have been born in a family that took the arts seriously, whether it was poetry, theater, music, particularly, the visual arts. My parents did not think of the arts as something additional or extra or optional. To them, the arts were central to how you lived. So, whatever else you did, your life was made meaningful uh, by the kinds of beauty, curiosity, uh, possibility, expansiveness that the arts create. So I grew up that way. I didn't have to fight to make a place for myself in the arts against resistance. In fact, my parents really wanted me to go to art school because I used to paint also as a child. And uh, it was entirely my own mistake that I eventually went off to study science, which I then gave up. And then I went to the social sciences and literature and aesthetics, but that's another story. So essentially, I have to thank my parents for having brought me up in this way and to have grown up with books and music. My earliest memories are actually have a lot to do with music because my parents had a turntable, which is a form of technology that not too many people will remember today. Um, so some of my earliest memories are of hearing them play LPs, which could be Ustad Vilayat Hussain Khan Sahab, for instance, or Ali Akbar Khan Sahab on the Sarod. It could be Tchaikovsky It could be a whole range of different forms of music. So, again, as a poet, a lot of my early training and listening came from music: cadence, rhythm, beat, lay. So, yeah, I hope that opens up some part of my childhood world for you. But
Yes, it is very much relatable because you were immersed in arts as well as in poetry, and same here. But I also sometimes go for science because I was also science, but I gave up it. But still doing science, so it's a very relatable affair with you and my. I would now ask you a question that what were some deep influences on your poetic consciousness in your ages from the beginning, in your middle age, and now? Some deep influences which you still see in your works and your writings.
let me put it this way: I think our the things that we respond to change from time to time. But for me, the big uh, shift, I would say, came when I was about 12 or 13 years old, and I found my parents' copy of T.S. Eliot's selected poems, and I began to read it. And it's not that it all made sense to me at that time. Some of it was quite startling. The use of language, the surreal, almost drama of the images. And although I couldn't immediately make complete sense of the poems, well, I realized later that I had been reading The Wasteland, for instance, and why it was such an important poem. It marked a distinct shift for me from the kinds of poems that, say, I was studying at school, which were much more in the, say, let's say, the romantic tradition: Byron, Keats, Shelley, Coleridge, and so on. And to me, that was really a turning point, to see how one could deal with language in a way that was different from formal cadence, from meter. And yet, it's not that it was without meter, it had its own mysterious, secret disciplines. So, this was to me a key experience that set me on the path to poetry. But well before that, I realized, as I said before, because of my receptivity, my responsiveness to music, I found myself responding to cadence, to musicality in the texts that I read. And also much later, I realized that because my mother would always she had some training as a classical musician. She was always humming either a bandish line from a composition, or it could be a Ghalib ghazal. uh, I had also clearly imbibed poetry in different forms in different languages. So, to me, if there's any lesson I take away from this, it is that we learn constantly from the various kinds of poems, the forms of music that we listen to, and these can be across languages.
Yes. Some of your favorite poets, same here. Shelley, T.S. Eliot, and Keats, and Ghalib also. Somehow they are difficult, and but yet there is a attraction towards their poetry. I found. Now I would ask about the way of your work, the mechanism of your poetry. Do you write in bits or in one go?
I've always written in fragments. I mean, I have notebooks that go back years and years now, where I write down, I make notes, I write in fragments. It could just be an image, it could be a line. Sometimes it's a line that I've overheard, possibly mistakenly, but there's a kind of a mysterious presence of language that leaps out from some everyday conversation, or an image, or I've, say, been at a museum and looked at a painting and it has spoken to me in a certain way. um, these This is my archive, and I go back to it, and the poems develop out of this, really, this activity of going back, sounding out those fragments and notes to see if they still stand a few years after they've been put down. And so most of my poems are built that way. There's a moment of energy that brings these fragments together sometimes, and very occasionally it does happen that I write a complete poem at one go, but that's very occasional. It's much more an additive, incremental, meditative process for me.
So are you a poet of first draft or you edit your work?
Constant editing. I'm not a poet of first. I mean, I always marvel at people who say, "I've put it down. This is the poem." I find that for me, it's much more artisanal and architectural. I have to work at it until I get it to a point where it feels right. So yes, very much a poet of revisions and editing.
So, do you revisit your work, and what do you feel? It is satisfaction, or is there something that is left to be expressed?
I think with all artists, whether we are painters or poets or novelists, you look back and you think that you could have probably done something better or differently. Sometimes you're reasonably happy with what you've achieved. And sometimes, if you are in a forgiving mood towards yourself, you even see the patterns that emerge. So, say even 10 or 15 years ago, my impulse when I looked at my earlier poetry would be to revise it, even though it was already published. So, when we produced this new and selected poems, um, a number of the early poems were kind of re-edited a little. I revised them. Today, I wouldn't do that. Today, I look back and see what the emerging patterns might have been. What are the recurrent images? What is it that continues to exercise my attention? These are the questions that I find myself asking. Yeah, so it's not. Even the way you look at your own poetry changes as the years pass. You look back at it for different reasons, and then sometimes you place it in the context of what you were reading, what you were open to, uh, other concerns of yours that may not necessarily reflect in the poetry. And then I think for all of us as poets, this is the key challenge. How do you bring the chaos and turbulence of the different things you're doing in your life? How do you bring that into some kind of consonance with the pattern and order you seek as a poet, as a writer?
Yes, I would say you that you are a polymath. You're not just a poet. You are a translator, curator, and culture theorist. So it was a curiousness about me that what does the intersection of poetry, art, translation, and culture look like to you?
They all spring. I mean, on the face of it, yes, it does look like they're all very different practices. But over the years, I've realized that I actually have a set of concerns that are in common. It if I want to just summarize it in a single sentence, it has to do with a recognition that we work out of a kaleidoscopic diversity of sources, and we need to acknowledge that. That's what makes our writing or our research or our understanding of the world so rich, so kaleidoscopic, even. So, for instance, when I'm working on cultural history, I'm very interested in how, in any historical moment, very, very dissimilar energies and forces came together. So, when I think, for instance, of a certain point in North Indian history, or Indian history, why just North Indian history? What interests me is the way in which languages traveled and their literatures. I mean, how did Braj move from the Braj Mandal to the West Coast to the Deccan? How did it meet and affect other languages? How do people create images out of ideas and impulses that come from very different places? That interests me. So, similarly, as a poet, I mean, I write only in one language, I write in English, but it's an imagination, a literary imagination that's fed by uh, literatures of different kinds, different languages. So, the music of those languages will inhabit whatever I write. So, again, it's the theme, if you will, that connects all my work is precisely the sense of bearing witness to plurality and to diversity.
Yes, we talked about you as a curator. If I'm not wrong, you began your journey as in curation as an art critic writing for Times of India. So, what would be the whole experience our audience would be, and for me also, we would happy to know that the Ranjit Hoskote as a curator also.
I began to write art criticism when I was about 19 years old, actually. I was still in college. And the Times of India in Bombay at that point had just gone through a great transformation. There was a new editorial team in place. There's an absolutely marvelous novelist and fiction writer called Shanta Gokhale, who became the arts editor. And she really placed her trust in a new young team of writers. So, in fact, Arundhati Subramaniam, who has been on your program before, came in to write about dance. She also wrote about theater. I wrote about the visual arts and about literature. And that to me was a very early experience in testing out ideas. I mean, how do you write and serve both as a bridge between paintings, sculptures, installations on the one hand, and audiences that are not always sure what's going on in art? How do you act as an interpreter? How do you act as a translator? How do you uh, respond to the mysterious work of the artist? And then at some point, I realized that I might need to show rather than to tell. So rather than writing out a piece of criticism, I continued to write criticism, of course, but I also realized that I took pleasure in creating exhibitions where I brought together different kinds of artists, showed how the artworks uh, could have a conversation amongst themselves, and how those artworks demonstrated some argument, or they were symbolic of some transformation that was underway. So my very first exhibitions were of this kind. Hinged by Light was an exhibition that brought together three abstract artists who were expanding their possibilities, moving beyond the painting into three-dimensional space, for instance. Uh, Private Languages was about artists who were employing far more literary strategies in their paintings, and how they were bringing a far more playful spirit into what had until that point been a very um, profoundly serious form of modernism, if you will. So to me, curation is criticism in four dimensions, because there's also time. Time is a very key dimension in curatorial practice because you're making a claim on the viewer's time. Time is where new propositions open up. They find place in your mind. Time is where you have dialogue. So for me, time is crucial. It's a major element in curating, in reading and writing as well. And in fact, you've just been talking about it. When you asked me to look back, you were in a way asking me to be a time traveler and to go back and see what things were like at different points. So it's a dimension that I find compelling. What are we as
Yes.
Kalpavasis? We are residents of time in some way.
So we talked about the interest of yours in the visual arts. So and you also once said in your interview that the art creates the possibility in the world. So what were the reasons that you see or that made you attracted toward visual arts, and does visual arts helped you in writing poetry in your literature?
As I said a little earlier there, when I began my journey at school, and when I was at home and at school, I used to paint as well as write. So I remember weekends were spent at home, really just working on my own paintings or working on poems. And at that point, I didn't feel any pressure to choose between these forms. But later, after I began to write on art and became a critic, somehow I stopped painting, more or less. So painted very occasionally. But for me, the visual arts have always been a stimulus to to art, to thinking, to poetry, because typically pictorial images resist language. They have their own reality, and they're both inviting you to speak about them, and they're uh, pushing you away. So I like that kind of push pull. So a number of my poems have, in fact, been triggered off by paintings or sculptures or the work of artists. I find that replenishing. I've always found it replenishing.
Yes. A poet is a person who is a creator, who is busy observing his surroundings. Amidst this, you are a cultural activist. How?
I think cultural activism is something that many of us would do almost as a matter of duty, I would say. Because when you're an artist of any kind, it's important that you're also committed to the larger context in which your writing, your paintings, your sculptures, your films, or your plays are going out. Because it seems like a solitary activity, producing art, but it only ever comes into its own when it's shared with other people. So then the question is, as an artist or a writer, do you not have a responsibility to that public domain? Uh, what are the possibilities that you will allow for your audience? What kinds of freedoms should they have? What kinds of works should flower in such an environment? How do we safeguard those freedoms? Those are automatically cultural and therefore political questions. So, also for a very long time, I've worked with the PEN, All India Center. This is something that my mentor Nissim Ezekiel used to run for many years. He was a poet, he was a critic, and he also was a cultural activist. So, in one sense, I've inherited that role. But increasingly, as you see, the challenges to writing, to literature, the challenges to freedom essentially are multiplying. So we have to confront those challenges. And whether we are writers or readers, we have to assert the freedom to write as we will, to read as we will, and to form communities of practice, as we are doing just now. In fact, we've not sought permission from anyone. Those questions were not
Yes.
submitted to a higher authority.
Yes. So you now talked about the challenges that are faced by writing literature. What does it mean to be a poet in the contemporary times, and what are the urgencies, the challenges, and the questions that are faced by the literarians?
People who are writing today, I think, face both. We've already talked about the political situations across the world where you have to assert your right to articulate your viewpoint, or to choose your imagery, or to choose your forms of writing. But I think we are also, as a as a species and a planet, we are at a particularly terrifying point in our history. It's a point when, thanks largely to human intervention that has been of an irresponsible kind, we've brought the planet to the brink of destruction. So then my question is, as a poet, or as a writer at large, how do I bear witness to that? How do I speak of the ecological catastrophe? What forms of solidarity would I advocate between humankind as a species and other species? How do I recognize the sanctity of the rights of other species to their own habitat? Uh, how do we consider rivers and lakes to have civil rights of some kind? These are a number of questions that have been important to me in recent years. It's a way of, if you think about it, many of the romantic poets, some of whom we mentioned earlier, tended to regard nature as something much larger and outside of themselves, almost divine in some ways. You and I live in a time when nature has been severely degraded and threatened. The ice caps are melting, sea levels are rising. In that situation, how do we respond to nature? Can we speak for nature? Can we, without just descending into sloganeering, how do we bear witness to what is happening to the natural world and us in relation to that natural world? This is, for me, a very key concern at this time.
Yes. And now I would talk about poetry collection, the recent poetry collection of yours, Hunchbros, which I would say the is a result of these urgencies like climate change and the democracy of species, many of that. So I would ask you a question that I know that many of that is a very profound question that is asked by you, asked from you, that what were the inspiration behind this catchy, unusual, attractive title, Hunch Bros?
Hunchbros. The word came to me magically, I have to say. I mean, it, it came out of nowhere in one sense. But I was thinking about how, at that time, I was thinking about how poetry sometimes gets seen as a kind of a stepchild or a kind of a distant cousin to prose. Prose is seen as the form in which you talk about major ideas, in which public debate takes place. Uh, and I thought, how interesting if poetry was seen as this kind of slightly disabled, unfavored kind of, uh, as I said, a step sibling or cousin of prose, and that somehow gave me the image of uh, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Victor Hugo's great novel. Uh, And all those ideas fused together into this word, hunch prose. Not prose, something that seems bent, broken, but in the fact that it is bent, is it opens up the possibility of seeing the world from another angle. And like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, however unfavored he may have looked, he made the most beautiful music when he rang the bells of the cathedral. So, to me, it was a way of thinking about poetry as something that might seem uh, to have to make its claim, uh, but which, precisely because it tends to be marginalized or vulnerable, can speak from a place, from that place of vulnerability. It can speak to us with great power. And in fact, during the lockdown, I was amazed at how many people were reading poetry, how they seemed to turn back to poetry for consolation, for reassurance, for healing. And poetry certainly has all of those capacities, if only we listen to it again.
Yes. Luckily, I would say I was reading poetry.
Brilliant.
So now I would talk about lockdown only. You once said in your interview, I think so by Hindustan Times it was, you said that it was 1 year, it was first in my life that I never been in a flight for a year.
Pretty much.
So
Yeah, I don't think I flew at all that year, 2020, from the beginning of the lockdown. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
yeah. So
Actually,
how was your lockdown? I would say, sorry to interrupt you, but I
no,
would
no.
say, how was your lockdown? And because it was a time of introspection and reclamation, so I would say, how was your lockdown and which poets do you read through that time?
The lockdown was actually a time of very complex and mixed feelings, because although it was for us, some of us who were able to introspect because we had the time and the leisure to do so, it was also a time of very painful awareness that millions of our fellow Indians were suffering because they had no social security of any kind, no assurances. These were populations of people who had worked to build and maintain our cities. And when the lockdown came, there was very little that was offered to them by way of habitation, livelihood, even just basic food. And you will remember these terrible scenes of literally thousands of people walking across the country to reach their homes in villages and small towns, where again they were not always welcome. So for me, the lockdown oscillated between these two moods: one of introspection and thinking through, and being in some kind of reflectiveness, whilst being aware that there were so many of our people who were suffering. And of course, the pandemic, as well as the forced migrations, they really produced intense anguish. So as a poet, I found myself responding to both of these scenarios. So that is what went. That's gone into another set of poems, which will be published later. But it was very much this dual awareness, and also a recognition that that contradiction was in play.
But were
So
the
in
books
a way,
that
the
you were
lockdown also called for certain resources of empathy, and I think to a great extent it really forced writers to accept that, while solitude is crucial, uh, the greater duty we have is the duty of empathy towards others. So, but to answer your other question about what I was reading, I reread a great deal, but I also found that I now had, I mean, at that point, then had the repose to read a number of Hindi poets who I'd read some of their work, but not all of their work, and I just took that occasion to sit tight and catch up on my reading of Hindi poetry. So Kumar Narayan, Kedarnath Singh, Mangalesh Dabral were, I mean, three poets, and Nagarjun, for instance. Yes, indeed, yeah. So this Rajkamal Pratinidhi Kavitaएं series was marvelous. Also, I had a copy of Ret Samadhi, which the author had, in fact, given me a couple of years ago. So I also read Ret Samadhi at that point. So Angitanjali Shri, the author, now has won the International Booker. So many more people know of her work now through the translation by Daisy Rockwell. But Ret Samadhi was also one of the books that I actually got out. She'd just given it to me in September 2019, so I read it over 2020 and 20.
Yes. Reading your poems, I have seen there is a blend of nature and animals that we talked also, that you have said also many times that you deny to be a city poet, rather a nature poet. So I would ask you, what were the message that you want to convey through them?
I don't have a messenger there. You know, Nabokov was once asked by someone, said, Mr. Nabokov, what is your message? And he said, Madam, I am not a postman. I do not have a message. So, in that sense, I don't have a message. Uh, but my point about not being a city poet is really because people assume that if you live in Bombay and work in Bombay or Delhi or Calcutta or New York or any of the cities, that you must automatically be a city poet. I'm not. That's not a very helpful definition of anything. Of course, I'm interested in the city and in urban environments and the thrum and the traffic of life here. But my deepest instincts connect me to the natural world. This also is because although I was born in Bombay, I spent the first 6 or 7 years of my life in Goa, which was very, very rural and idyllic at that time. And then we came back to Bombay. So my early childhood was spent very much in a house on a hill with a forest right behind. So awareness of animal life, of vegetation, of greenery, of forests, that's primary to me, and it now increasingly coincides with my very sharp awareness that animal species are facing extinction, that the natural world is endangered. So these two things come together very strongly for me: a great love of nature and an awareness that it's endangered and threatened. So yeah, so I wouldn't want to choose between labels. It's not a question of am I a city poet or a nature poet. This is just something one would say polemically. But yeah, nature is crucial to me. I find myself greatly replenished when I also, I've grown up with animals. It was a dog or several cats or a dog and a cat. So in a way, it also, when you spend so much time in close and intimate proximity with animals, you're also communicating in different ways. And I think for many of us, uh, it's really a question also of now realizing that we need to communicate across species. You know, humankind is very proud of its linguistic abilities. We're always saying that we are the speaking animal. But there are many other forms of communication that we are not very good at, and we need to develop those skills.
Yes. And that was a very deep, I would say, message or meaning that your poems imitates. Now I would ask you that while reading some of your poems, I feel that many of your poems are being dedicated or are in memoriam to your colleagues, contemporaries, and many of the artists and the poets.
Right.
What were the reasons or inspiration that you jot down? I would use jot word here. Jot down that poems and the collection that Hunchbros. There are many poems which are dedicated to your contemporaries and poets.
Hunchbros probably has fewer dedications than many of the other books, but to me, the dedication is an important gesture because it acknowledges the role that someone might have played in your life or your imagination or your way of looking at the world. So there are poems for artists whose work has been important to me. There are poems for poets whose work has inspired mine or um, from which I've drawn sustenance. Um, in some cases, it's colleagues. Sometimes it just marks the context in which a poem emerged. So to me, it's a dedication of that kind also shows that the poem can be different things. Sometimes it can be a gift, sometimes it can be a residue, and in all cases, it's a continuing dialogue with what I've sometimes thought of as a larger gharana of fellow writers, artists, readers. The poem to me is never an isolated object. It forms part of a larger and continuing conversation with people alive, dead, passed on, long dead sometimes. You know, those conversations never really end. Aga Shahid Ali has a book with a very beautiful title, These Rooms Are Never Finished. So, in the same way, many of our conversations never are finished. continue across centuries sometimes.
Yes. Now I would talk about you as a translator. You once said also, translator is broken and remade by the act of translating. So how important in the contemporary situations translation is in such a country, bilingual country, India, and you also a bilingual, I would say, a person who know more than 7 languages. So how important translations is? So yeah.
Translation is crucial. I mean, we're a multilingual country. We're actually in a linguistic sense, also geographically. Honestly, we're a continent. So it's really important that translation be taken very seriously because you have people who belong to different languages, come from different sorts of literary heritages, and if you're going to find common ground, it's only translation that can provide it because when you occupy a language, you also occupy a particular history, you occupy a particular sensitivity, certain assumptions are taken for granted. And how do you communicate these? It has to be through translation. Also, translation instills a curiosity about the other. You don't, I mean, there are three ways of dealing with another language. Either you say you tolerate it, which doesn't mean anything in particular, it just means that you're adjacent, or you're neglectful of it, you're indifferent, or you take it seriously, you engage with it and you learn more. The fact is, the more languages one knows, the more literatures one accepts, frankly, you find yourself being enriched by these experiences. So for me, translation and therefore an existence across languages allows one to do just that. It allows us to travel into the minds of other people, into other worlds, and to extend oneself through certain kind of empathy to people who are not like us. And I think that's crucial, that you have to be able to find common ground. There's far too much pressure on us today to be antagonistic towards one another. And that's a bad thing. We simply have to find common ground, recognize what is special and important about people who are different from us, and embrace and celebrate that difference.
Yes. You have done some beautiful translations of Kashmiri mystic Lal Ded, and which I have read also. They are fabulous translations. The book
Thank
I
you.
Lala. So I would ask you that you also said that after doing that translations, there was a transformation of the way you think about spirituality and the religious experiences. So how would your experience by translating Lal Ded, a Kashmiri mystic, and what the poet given to you as a mentor, or how you would describe the poet as? Because I you also said that it took 20 years to translate the poetry.
Yes, it took 20 years. Also because my own sense of the translation changed over that period. And as you rightly said, my own views on spirituality changed. Very early on, I realized that my own. I mean, I was in my early 20s when I began the translation. So in a way, it's not a project. For me, it was part of my. It was a life project. It was a transformation project in a certain way. So sometimes, especially when you're young and you're translating, you are full of energy and enthusiasm, and you feel that you can render this text into something that is recognizably your work in a certain way. Wisdom and maturity lies in recognizing that you learn from the text that you're translating, and that's what I meant. It's in fact the line you quoted is from the introduction to my Laldev translation. The translator is broken and remade in the process of translation. I think that's absolutely true. I think when you approach the task of translation, you do so in a spirit of humility. You come to the original text as an apprentice, as someone who's learning, as someone making a journey to a shrine even. And it's exactly how it was for me with Laldian, because reading her works also involved a considerable amount of research, looking back into the contexts of the works, and recognizing that here was a very courageous poet, a woman poet in the 14th century, who had set out to discover her relationship to the divine. So, whether you believe in the divine or not is a secondary question. What you take away from this, what I took away certainly, was an understanding that as a poet, you stand in the presence of something that is much larger than yourself. You might want to call it the divine or the sublime, but the fact is that as a poet, a task like this, a project like this, a translation like this just serves to remind you of the great expanses and vistas that await you. So, in a way, you take your place as a particle in the infinite, but you also take your place as someone who's participating fully in this drama that's much larger than yourself. It's an antidote to narcissism, really. And I find that it's very useful. It takes you outside of yourself. You learn that uh, writing poetry, working on translations, it's not about asserting the self. It's about fashioning the self in response to challenges, to stimuli, to gifts that are made to you by poets who died long ago, and blessings,
Yes.
really. So to me, Lala
Yeah.
is very much a mentor. I see her as traveling with me in all else that I do.
Some of the favorite verse, if you can share with us, of that translated verse that you liked most from that collection.
From the Lala translation, okay, I can tell you this one, which is one of my favorite verses. What the books taught me, I've practiced. What they didn't teach me, I've taught myself. I've gone into the forest and wrestled with the lion. I didn't get this far by teaching one thing and doing another. One shrine to the next, the hermit can't stop for breath. Soul, get this, you should have looked in the mirror. Going on a pilgrimage is like falling in love with the greenness of faraway grass. And a third one that I'll read now. I burnt up the landscape with footprints, looked for him everywhere. Then it hit me. What am I thinking? He's everywhere. Lala distilled this truth from 100 pieces of talk. Now hear this, people, and go mad. So for
Beautiful,
me,
sir.
Lala was
Beautiful.
also, thank you there. Now, Lala was also this figure to me who had the courage to stand outside of orthodoxy, outside of received wisdom. She had the courage to make her own path. She was an autodidact. She taught herself, as she says in that book. So, to me, this is an exemplar for how we can all be, whether we are writers or readers or seekers. It's about having this courage to fashion your own path with a certain responsibility to the larger universe, but also an awareness that uh, you need to refashion your consciousness. You can't rely on old dogmas and formulae.
Yes, absolutely right, I would say. Now, I would talk about two poets who are, I would say, very much loved. You are loving with that poets. First is Ghalib, and second is Mir Taki Mir, who you are
Yes,
translating also. And I would ask you that what Ghalib and Mir Taki Mir means to you. And one of your poems that you have written in that Vanishing Acts, Ghalib in the Winter of Great Revolt. So
right.
I would say that if you can explain that poem also, and you can tell your experience while reading Ghalib and Meet the Kimir.
Okay. Ghalib was part of my growing up because my mother was a great fan of Ghalib's work, and she would often recite his ghazals, and of course they were also in the movies. You heard wherever you turned, Ghalib would come to you in one form or another. It was much later. I think it was early in my early 20s that I began to think about translating Ghalib, and I warmed to Ghalib as a figure because um, he was a survivor. He was a person in a time of difficult transitions. Remember that he lived right across the the very historically difficult transition from the late Mughal period to British rule. And the poem that you refer to, in fact, has to do with Ghalib surviving the aftermath of the 1857 revolt, the Great Revolt of 1857, when the British are resurgent, they destroy the old system, they impose new restrictions. So to me, and similarly, Mir, I came to Mir really through Ghalib, because Ghalib didn't have a high opinion of too many poets, but he thought Mir was one of the great immortal poets. Mir lived about a century before Ghalib, but and in also in chaotic, difficult times. So to me, it was a case of being in the company, if you will, the very replenishing company of these two great Urdu poets. One who lived towards the end of the 18th and in the early 19th century, the other who lived right across the 19th century. And the more I read on Ghalib, for instance, I realized that this is an ironic, playful, uh, pensive, supremely intelligent poet who's not relying on lyrical formulae, who's pushing the boundaries of what it means to be irreverent, to be rebellious. And that's when you look at the dates and you realize that he was the contemporary, the exact contemporary of Heinrich Heine in Germany, Baudelaire in France, Walt Whitman in the US. Uh, he was a modernist. Sometimes we don't realize that just because someone was part of another historical narrative, they were also part of a much larger global shift. And to me, Ghalib represents that. Mir, I respond to for different reasons. Ghalib's Urdu is very Persianate. Ghalib saw himself essentially as a Persian writer who deigned to write in Urdu. But for Mir, he drew on everything. He drew on Braj, on Awadhi, on Farsi, whatever the resources that were available. So I respond strongly to Mir as a poet who works with an incredible linguistic montage, who was able to bring this into a speaking voice that is urgent as well as lyrical. And he's both of these poets are bearing witness to dark and difficult times. So I think that is why they speak to us so strongly today. There is sometimes a misapprehension that these great Urdu poets were talking about birds and butterflies and gardens and romance. But when you look closely, you'll also find that they're talking about historical chaos, about personal anguish, about exile, about the quest for a lost order. These are very, very important themes in the poetry of Mir and of Khalid.
Yes. No, I would ask that I also used to say that I was introduced by Ghalib from Gulzar Sahab's episode that was Ghalib, yeah. And
Yes.
in one of the scenes there was a, I would say, a mushaira or a gatherings of the poets where I was introduced by Mir Taki Mir as well as many other contemporaries of Ghalib. And though reading Diwane Ghalib, it's difficult, but yeah, it's the attractiveness of the poetry. So, can you name some of the favorite verse of yours, even though Ghalib and Mir? You
Mir,
quote
so
also in.
many. I could. I mean, I could actually quote that to you. Let me look for it. I could maybe read you a little of. Also, I find my eye uh, settling on individual individual ashar, and this is also the way I've been looking at these ghazals. I mean, I see them as these garlands of jewels which you pick up, and they suddenly speak to your moment amazingly. Now, take a look at this from me. धूप में जलती हैं गुर्बत वतनों की लाशें तेरे कूचे में मगर साया ए दीवार न था. The sun burns up the corpses of those driven from their homeland. Your lane did not offer them even the shadow of a wall. Or this one. Let me find another one that. Yeah. दिल की वीरानी का क्या मज़कूर है ये नगर सौ मर्तबा लूटा गया. Of the heart's ruination, what report? This city's been looted 100 times over. So, this is what I was talking about when we spoke just now. That in Mir, particularly, remember that he finally leaves Delhi and moves to Awadh because it's been attacked so many times by Abdali during the raids that He's also asking himself, what does it mean for me to live in a city that is just reduced to ruin? So this sense of being homeless, of being a refugee, these are very contemporary conditions to us. And that's why these voices of Mir or of Ghalib speak across the decades, across 2 centuries to us still.
Yes. I would ask a question from you that hope that it would be good for that if you get a chance to talk to a poet, to have a conversation with a poet who is no more and who is your favorite or who you admire, but you never get a chance to talk with. So who were the poets? And I know that would be a long list. And what would the conversation that you would have?
I would have liked to have spoken with Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, uh, because again, some of his poetry has resonated very, very strongly for me. It's a poetry, as you know, that has to do with political turbulence in Ireland, but also to do with the deep resources of poetry in myth, in song, in the earth, in the rhythms of of field and forest. So I would have liked to have had a conversation with him about his work, uh, but that was a missed opportunity, unfortunately. Oh, and I would have liked to have talked to Mir, particularly because I'm working so closely on his poems right now. I would have liked to know more about. Of course, he's left behind a memoir, the Zikre Mir, but it would have been nice to have known some of these people. On the other hand, Eunice D'Souza has this poem where she writes to say, "Best to meet in poems." So, sometimes it can be disappointing to meet poets in real life. Uh, but fortunately, not often. My own experience of meeting poets has been always wonderful. Yeah, but again, they've left us their poems. It's in their poems that we meet them and find them often at their illuminating best.
Yes. I would ask you that how that writing fits in your life. Are you good at managing time?
I wish I was. Uh, it's always a struggle to balance off all of these different things that one is caught up with. But over a period of time, you develop a kind of a schedule, some sort of rough timetable. Increasingly, I've tried to create my schedule around my writing and reading of poetry or translation, my literary work. But there have been long periods when, and sometimes when you're working on a large scale project, there's no option. You just have to be fully committed to it. But it's very important that you, whatever else you're doing, like a classical musician has her or his riyaz or sadhana, you need to make time to devote yourself to your art, whatever it is that is central to you. It's not something you can do on the weekends or as and when you have a moment. You have to have a certain rigor and discipline. All
Yes.
musicians do this, for instance. All athletes do it. So it's not different from for poets.
Yes. I would ask you that reading your poetry, I feel that there is an abstract metaphor. How important it is metaphor in poetry according to you?
In one sense, metaphor is the key condition of poetry. Consider the etymology of the word itself. It means something that transfers meaning, right? That carries change. Metaphoros could mean the bearer of change. And to me, that's where the marvel and the magic of language lies. You take something that seems to have one first order, everyday kind of meaning, and then somehow, through a tweak or a subtle nuance, it brings about a completely different meaning, a shift of value, if you will. And images do that, metaphors do that. So for me, it's very important. I've often thought that in many ways, it's metaphor is for me the central aspect of poetry, because that is why we come to poetry. Poetry is a platform where language is transformed and our consciousness is transformed with it. So metaphor is key. We really begin to see the world afresh from a different angle, under a different sign through metaphor. It's like a cleansing of the vision.
Yes. We talked about metaphor, which is a key element of the poetry. I would know from you that What are some important elements of poetry that makes a good poetry, and what is a good poetry? I would ask from.
I don't have an answer to that there because there are very, very different kinds of poems, very different kinds of poets who have different concerns. Some might want to explore deeply the anxieties and the traumas of the individual self. Other poets have a much larger historical view. Some poets manage to bridge these. So there's no one sort of set formula, one size fits all for this. But you know that you've read a good poem. You know you've been moved by a poem when you look up from it and realize that you're seeing the world differently. It could be done in a very simple way. For instance, it could be done because the use of a word has meant that that word will never have just that simple deadwood feeling for you. Uh, Sometimes a subject is addressed that you had not thought of in quite that same way before, or a form has been used in a certain way, or a form from one language has been used in another language. The pantoum, for instance, can be taken from its Malay tradition and brought into English. The sonnet originally made a journey from Italian into English. The ghazal, famously, Aga Shahid Ali, among other poets, has used the ghazal in English. So there are different ways in which poet can a poem and a poet can reorient our attention. So there's no fixed canonical formula for this. What makes for a good poem? But ideally, a good poem should be able to transform language and make it estrange us from language in order to help us to embrace it. So just make it afresh, make it new.
Yes. What changes do you see in the world of literature and arts from the time when you were new to it and towards now? So, what are the changes? Because changes is one of the most important part of time. So, changes which are good as well as bad for the arts as well as in the world of literature.
Let me focus on the world of literature for now. I think what we see today is a great spectrum of platforms for poetry. You have far more journals than were at least available in the old days. And journals today that are digital, online, as well as in print. You have platforms of different kinds where poets can read. You have uh, you have spoken word poetry, but you've also got many more anthologies that are being put together. So I think one of the key shifts is that the world of poetry has become more inclusive, more democratic even than it was when I began. I also think that poets are probably much more aware today of the other arts. There always were some poets who were concerned with the other arts, but today I think there's a much more visceral, immediate sense of what's happening in the world of gaming, or in the world of music, or in the world of cinema. I think this is probably a big shift. Probably has to do with the fact that we live in a far more digitalized multimedia environment than we did 30 or 35 years ago. And this in turn might produce new forms of poetry. I think it's already doing that. So poetry is available not only in the classical sense of something that is read in person or on the page, but poetry is something that's part of a uh, larger artistic project. And in one way, we would be going back to where poetry came from. Poetry also came from pageant, from festivity, from ritual. It came from a multisensory world. So to me, this is one of the big shifts that is probably underway.
Yes, we talked about poetry. According to you, in the contemporary times, when the youth is far from literature, how much does the poetry matters? I would say literature matters, and what is how the literature influences the socio and political situations of the world.
You're young, and you don't seem to be at all far away from literature. So where are these young people who are distant from literature? I think everybody's reading in one form or another. So I don't believe that, because every 4 years someone comes to you and says poetry was dead and now it seems to be reborn. And poetry never quite dies. Poetry is constantly being renewed and replenished. Might just take new avatars, might take new forms. But as to the question of why poetry matters, I think it's because poetry will always be the counterpoint. Poetry is the position that stands apart from the chaos and turbulence of what is happening and offers you a reflective pause, or offers you a way of seeing this whole situation afresh, or offers you consolation, like I said earlier, or healing, or equips you with resources of hope to look to a future that is beyond these present difficulties. And all of this is it has a great psychic, I would say, necessity. That's the urgency and the need for poetry. It's one of the great uh, spiritual infrastructures of life.
Yes. I would now ask you about a big escape that you do in the present times, that we can't understand the poetry because of language, because of metaphor, or because in arts also because of the abstraction of the arts or the abstract art. But according to you, how to read a poetry and how to understand the modern arts?
I see the difficulty, and I'm very aware of this, particularly in the question of art, where see, artistic strategies sometimes tend to put such a distance between themselves and the viewer that viewers then wonder if it's worth the trouble. But I think it's whether it's reading a poem or looking at a painting, uh, your experience of that exceeds the moment in which you actually see the painting or just read the poem. I think there is something like a reader's share or a viewer's share, and that's a responsibility that we need to take up as readers, as viewers. You go out and learn more about the poem or that book or the poet or about the painting or the art. And so, the activity of reading or of viewing, it's a continuous process of equipping yourself uh, through more intensive experiences of viewing or of reading, of studying that form, really. After all, this is what happens in music, for instance. People take the trouble to understand how that art form works, or in theater. I mean, there are conventions to each art, and you learn them and you embrace them. I think part of the way in which this question gets phrased is the assumption that you must immediately understand a poem or a painting. But sometimes you carry a poem or a painting with you for many years, and suddenly there's an illumination, and you understand it better. This also has to do with the role of time that we were talking about earlier. You know,
Yes.
time, growth, change, your own. I mean, I remember, for instance, when I was in standard, what do they call it now, the sixth grade. I remember that I read two Shakespeare plays in one of the holidays in that year. What was I? I was 10 years old. King Lear and Coriolanus. And I thought King Lear was dreary, this silly old man who keeps making mistakes and then falls down all over a heap and messes up his life. This was my reading when I was 10. And Coriolanus is this heroic soldier of Rome who also makes mistakes, but it seemed to be a very heroic figure at that time to me. It's the same two plays that I had when I was at university for my MA. And I was shocked to realize that, however old I was, 18 or 19 or 20, that my perception of those plays was exactly the opposite. When I read King Lear, I found myself deeply moved by the tragedy of a king who's also a human being, who makes these terrible errors, who lurches from one misunderstanding of the world to another. So I'd reached out to this man with sympathy, whilst when I was age 10, I, dismissed him. And Coriolanus, I couldn't bear to read the play because I just thought this man was such a bombastic military figure who was completely out of sympathy with anything happening around him. He was only obsessed with his own narcissistic self. So for me, it was a radical lesson in reading. You know, reading the same plays at age 10 and then age 20, 10 years apart, it was a complete switch in my perception of those two plays. So this can certainly happen to us as readers. And it should probably happen because texts are living things, whether they're plays or poems or novels. You go back to them and you realize that they have an inner life of their own, which is going on, irrespective of you.
We are talking about your literary life. We talked about the poetry. Now, it would be good for us if there would be a poetry recitation, and it would be what would a good honor for a reader of a poet to listen the poetry from the writer only. So, I would request you for some to recite some of your poems.
Sure, thank you there. I'll read. Let me read about three or four poems. I'm going to read a poem called Stain, which is from Hunchbros. Stain. The rain howls at a window left ajar. The apple left on the table is a porcelain ghost of itself, its shadow a patch of fungus. When the archaic bird in the cabinet wakes up, the pomegranate on the sideboard will explode, ripping through the transparent curtains, staining with 1,000 pink tongues the view of hills they used to frame. I'm going to read one called Hawk. Caught up on the wave of the past, a hawk skirls back, ripping the seamed and sutured scar of our passage. Its wings are lined with scripts no one can read, but everyone brawls over. In this city of howling dogs and winning saints, the blood that spurts under its claws is common, the sort you could smell anywhere, the sort you can smell everywhere. Suffer us all, dear God of many names, to come together and feed ourselves to that insatiable beak. And then I'll read one called Table. Always make place at the table for the guest who walks in with a peony, who's exchanged his drawl for a twang, who once sliced the moon in half with a whistle, who struck a vein of gold in his sleep, who goes red in the face laughing at his own jokes, and for the guest who left the house 40 years ago with a wooden bowl and a vow of silence. One brings you a charter of demands, the other a chaplet of skyflowers. And I'll maybe read as a fourth poem, Pigeon. We were talking about animals, birds, and nature. This really comes from an experience that I actually had sitting in this very room many years ago. Pigeon. A pigeon taps its beak on the wrong side of the glass. Visitant strayed in on a stormy morning, its rainbow neck the faintest memory of sunshine, the sky now a palette of remorseless grays, this gray bird lost. But there, is that okay?
Yes, sir. So I would now ask you some book recommendations for the viewers that you would recommend us some of the books.
Okay. I'll 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 maybe recommend some of my own favorite reading, quite frankly. Uh, this is a book I've been reading now. It's by Carl Torabuli. It's called Cargo Hold of Stars, Coolitude. Torabuli is a Mauritian uh, poet, which also means that he has some Indian connections, and he writes in French. And the translator is Nancy Naomi Carlson. It's an absolutely wonderful book that really builds out of the mixed and marvelous histories of the sea, of the people who migrated across it, people who sometimes were taken away as slaves, as laborers, and how did they make a life and a history for themselves out of these very adverse and unpromising conditions. So there's a great deal of the heroism of the people of the ocean in this book, and it's beautifully written. I would also very strongly recommend a book written by my friend and mentor Ruth Badell. who's a marvelous poet and novelist. It's called 52 Ways of Looking at a Poem. It began as a column that she used to write for the papers, and then it developed into. You were asking earlier, how do we bridge the gap between poems and readers, or works of art and readers? This book does exactly that. It takes you by the hand as a reader and shows you how poems work. What do they do with assonance, with rhyme, with cadence, with image, with sound? What is the music? What is the visual texture of a poem? It's absolutely marvelous, and it's an act of celebration of poetry. To and it's I think that's really important for readers to have that. This is a favorite book that I go back to often. Aga Shahid Ali's early book of poems, The Half-Inch Himalayas, and it's always been a source of inspiration to me, both for its literary experimentation and the fact that Shahid was such an incredibly generous person as a poet, as a translator, as a friend of poets. So I would make these three recommendations for sure. And there's an old favorite of mine, Czeslaw Miłosz, the Polish American poet who won the Nobel Prize at some point, the 80s. This is the collected poems, and again, the form of the collected poems is something I respond to, anyone's collected poems, because they really show you the journey that was charted by a poet, with its ups and downs, with its various directions, with the different kinds of personae and voices that the poet has tried on. So, and each time you open it, it's like a treasure chest. You open it on any page, and suddenly you feel you haven't read this poem before because you haven't read it for a long time, and it speaks to you afresh. That's the magic of books. They go back to them and they turn out to be other books than they were, that you thought. They've changed meanwhile.
Yes, the new generation of the children are less inclined towards literature. They are inclined toward more ways of like games, online games, and many other things.
Sure.
So what is your message towards them? What's the tips towards them so they are they attract towards literature, or they read literature?
That's a difficult one because when people enjoy what they're doing, they sometimes feel that you're coming here and imposing something on them when you say you must read. My message, such as it is, would simply be that you should read because just as much as a game or anything else you might be involved in, reading a book is also an adventure. It's a source of mystery. You might find something out. You might discover something about yourself. And I think that's the inexhaustible mystery of reading and of a book. You start out because you want to know something about the writer. And as you get into the book, into the narrative, into the story, into the poems, you come away learning something about yourself. And I think that's frankly one of the key purposes of life, to get a sense of who we are. That's why we're in the world. Far too many of us tend to muddle along with no real sense of who we are or what our sense of purpose is. And I think that's where books are our companions, they're fellow pilgrims, they're guides. They can be many things. They're presences, really, and they can play a great role in our lives in this way. There's no other
Yes.
answer to this, really. It's it's if you want a deeper sense of yourself, a deeper sense of why you're in the world and what you could do in the world, then reading is an absolutely indispensable part of that quest.
Yes, sir. I would need some tips for the budding writers from you. That would personally work for me also and for our viewers.
Just one. You've got to write. You've got to read as much as you write. More, in fact. You have to read. You have to be first a reader in order to be a writer. Because every now and again I'll hear someone say this, oh, I don't read because I don't want to be influenced by other people. And you want to say, anything you write has probably been written before. It's But if you're going to be a writer, you have to understand that your writing is going out into a world of people who've been writing for thousands of years. So you have to know that world. You have to read. I mean, you really have to read and see what other poets are doing, see what other novelists, non-fiction writers might be doing, what's happening in theater. This is vital. What script writers are doing, for instance. You might learn from other forms, from cinema, for instance, or from theater. So my suggestion would be that anyone who wants to write should immerse themselves in reading and keep at it. You have to revise your work. Don't assume that just because something came to you at one shot that it's absolutely perfect. You have to test it out, make sure it's working.
Yes. We would end this beautiful session by this question that I would request you to recite one of your favorite poems by your favorite poet.
Okay. Oh, there you got me. All right. I mean, I have a number of favorite poems. I thought I might have read something by James Merrill, but I think I will read Aga Shahid Ali's poem Postcard from Kashmir, which I've returned to many, many times over the years. Postcard from Kashmir by Aga Shahid Ali. It goes like this: Kashmir shrinks into my mailbox, my home a neat 4 by 6 inches. I always loved neatness. Now I hold the half-inch Himalayas in my hand. This is home, and this the closest I'll ever be to home. When I return, the colors won't be so brilliant. The Jahlam's waters so clean, so ultramarine. My love so overexposed. And my memory will be a little out of focus. In it, a giant negative, black and white, still undeveloped. So that is certainly one of my favorite poems. It's about home, about being away, about exile, about wanting to return.
Beautiful, sir. And it was really a master class, inner feeling class. I have learnt a lot, and I apologize for any mistake that would happen. And it was thank you again for you, and thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much once again for trusting me, for giving your time, and we had a wonderful conversation.
I'm very glad to hear it. Thank you, and thank you to everyone who's all your colleagues on this platform. And as you said, I will write this down as a unique experience, having had a conversation with a 14-year-old reader. So thank you very much indeed, and all the very best to you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.